But here it's not an animal, it's Jesus. Don't we always present ourselves with a picture of priests and altars and animals, and all pertaining to the Old Testament or the Hebrew Scriptures? But in the book of Romans, Paul introduces a new kind of sacrifice, not just rooted in temple rituals, but fulfilled in Jesus and reflected in how we live. So let's just do a little walk through how Paul weaves this sacrificial theme, Jesus, into the heart of his letter to the Romans. Now, this is a very well thought out letter, and it is the most prominent of Paul's doctrinal letters. And he had some help in putting this letter together. And surprisingly, that help is actually named in Romans chapter 16 and verse 22. And the name of this helper is one who is called Tertius. Now, we're going to put a link in the credits of this to get some background into the scribes, and in particular, of course, into Tertius. Because Paul sees that humanity has a fundamental problem. Everyone, Jews and Gentiles alike, they have sinned as a matter of inheritance. So let's read how Paul describes it himself. We're going to go to Romans chapter 3 and verses 9 and 10, where he starts putting this together. He says, "What then? Are we any better? Not at all. For we have already made the charge that Jews and Gentiles alike are all under sin. As it is written, there is no one righteous, not even one." And he goes on a bit further in verse 23, where he states, "For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God." We're very familiar with that, aren't we? And this, of course, sets the stage for what we're going to be discussing today in this letter to the Romans. Now, before we talk about sacrifices or salvation, Paul shows why we actually need it. Because sin separates us from God. And here is his point. Justice must be satisfied. So how is that achieved? Well, Paul has the answer. This is the process of hilasterion. It has the meaning, really, of relating to an appeasing or expiation in order to placate someone else. A propitiation, in other words. Now keep that thought in mind. It's very important. And it was used to describe the cover of the Ark of the Covenant, the propitiatory cover that we've come to be familiar with. Now, this was sprinkled, the cover, this was sprinkled with the blood of the propitiatory victim on the Day of Atonement as a sacrifice offered to God in order to appease him. Now, please keep these thoughts in mind in order to fully understand Paul's ideas. What's the solution? He has a solution. And Paul introduces this solution in deeply sacrificial terms. Let's go to Romans chapter 3 and verse 25, where we read, God presented him as an atoning sacrifice in his blood through faith, in order to demonstrate his righteousness, because in his forbearance he had passed over the sins committed beforehand. What Paul is saying here is that God presented Christ as a hilasterion, a place of atonement through the faith in his blood. Now, the Greek word hilasterion, it refers to the mercy seat on the Ark of the Covenant, the place where the high priest would sprinkle the blood on the Day of Atonement. Now, if you go to Strong's Concordance, Helps with Studies, the NAS Exhaustive Concordance, Thayer's Greek Lexicon, we'll put the link in the credits for you, you'll find confirmation of this. So what Paul is saying is that Jesus is now that place, not a goat, not a temple. Jesus himself becomes the atonement. And of course, he doesn't stop there. Paul describes Jesus' death using more temple language. When we go to Romans chapter 5 and verse 6, for example, where we read, "For at just the right time, while we were still powerless, Christ died for the ungodly." We carry into verse 8. "But God proves his love for us in this: while we were still sinners, Christ died for us." Verse 9. "Therefore, since we have now been justified by his blood, how much more shall we be saved from the wrath through him?" And then finally in verse 10, "For if, when we were enemies of God, we were reconciled to him through the death of his Son, how much more, having been reconciled, shall we be saved through his life?" See what Paul is doing? He's drawing on the Levitical idea of substitution, that the blood of another brings cleansing and peace. But here it's not an animal, it's Jesus. But now comes a surprising turn. When we go to Romans chapter 6 and also in Romans 12, Paul doesn't just talk about what Christ sacrificed. He calls on us to become sacrifices too. In Romans chapter 6 and verse 30, this is what he says: "Present yourselves to God as instruments of righteousness." Instruments of righteousness. And in being pleasing to God, Romans chapter 12 and verse 1, he says, "Present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true worship." This is no longer burnt offerings. It's about how we live, holy, surrendered, and transformed. So, why does Paul use sacrificial language in Romans? Well, I always find it helpful to have a sort of a visual in mind. And so, guess what? We've prepared another little table. When you look at this table, you see a section, theme, and sacrificial connection. Section Romans 1 to 3. The theme is humanity's sin, the sin that's been inherited. And the sacrificial connection, the need for atonement. In Romans 3:25, we see Christ's atoning death. And the sacrificial connection, Jesus as the mercy seat, the hilasterion. And then when we go to Romans chapter 5, it's about blood and reconciliation, which is the theme. And Jesus, in the sacrificial connection, Jesus is the substitute. Romans chapter 6 and 12. What is our response? And again, the sacrificial connection, lives offered in faith. We are the sacrifice in faith. So in other words, Jesus fulfills the sacrifice and we live it out through faith. Now, just reflect on that for a moment. Paul didn't just borrow temple terms just for decoration's sake. No. He reimagined the entire sacrificial system in the light of Jesus' death. The altar is no longer in Jerusalem. It's in Jesus' death. The offering is no longer an animal. It is Jesus himself. And the high priest, you've guessed it, it's Jesus once for all time. Now, if you are exploring what it really means to follow Jesus, please stay tuned for the next part in analysing Paul's theology as we continue into this letter to the Romans, chapter 7 through to 11 in the next video. So until then, thank you very much, but please like and subscribe if you found this helpful. Thank you very much.